Hello, my name is Victorian Salem, and I lecture on history and exploration. The Hebrides Islands, just off the coast of Scotland, are among my favourite places in the world, and Silversea Expedition ships have taken me to the Outer Hebrides a number of times over the last 10 years and more. That's how I've managed to take so many photos, some of which I'd now like to share with you. If you haven't already accompanied me to Iona and Staffa on the Inner Hebrides, maybe you'd like to take a tour there after this one. It's difficult to beat the Hebridean Islands for their richness in history, architecture, wildlife and natural beauty, and the weather can be much better than you'd expect, especially in the spring. On this map, the green area is Scotland, the pink area the Inner Hebrides, and the orange area the Outer Hebrides. Today's tour will take us to two of the Outer Hebridean Islands, which you can see represented by coloured shapes. We will start on the island of Lewis, which is the largest of all the Scottish islands, and then we will sail west and south into the Atlantic Ocean, finally finishing up on the tiny and very remote archipelago of St Kilda. Although Lewis and Harris are two parts of a single island, there is a natural barrier of high mountains and forbidding moorland between them. In the past, the two communities were so entirely isolated from one another that they hardly ever met. Visiting this unusual island is like stepping into the pages of a Scottish fairy tale. There is certainly something for everyone, from ancient man-made structures to modern crofts, and from rugged coastlines with white sandy beaches to lunar-like rocky plateau in the mountains. Lewis is the lower-lying, more fertile part of the island in the north, and therefore contains larger settlements. Stornoway is the main town of the island, with a population of around 8,000 out of a total island population of just over 19,000. Our tour takes us first to one of the two most iconic sites in Lewis, a typical black house village. It's not completely clear where the name Black House comes from. Was it because the earlier examples were dark inside, small-windowed and constantly smoke-filled through having no chimneys? Or was it simply to differentiate them from the newer, cleaner so-called white houses, which were constructed with built-in fireplaces and with separate areas for livestock and humans? Either way, entering a black house village is a great way to understand how people on Lewis lived, some of them right up to the 1970s. The dwellings you can see here have only been standing around 150 years, but used a thatched roof design that went back thousands of years, being enclosed by two concentric dry stone walls with an earth or peat-filled gap between them. The interiors of the black houses and the museum on Lewis date back only to the 1950s. You will find a peat fire still smoulders in the middle of the main room, though the animals are no longer in residence. They would have stood on an earth floor, hopefully with a drain in it, whereas the family at the other end of the house were usually raised a little on a flagged floor. Weaving was an important cottage industry, though usually carried out by women, and there were many utensils, tools, items of kitchenware, clothes and simple furnishings cluttering up the relatively small space. Often the beds were boxed into the walls, but there were still dressers, cupboards, tables and stools to negotiate around. After this taste of traditional life on Lewis, we move on to my favourite site on the island, the mystic site of Callanish. 42 of these stones remain, surrounding a small chambered tomb containing datable pottery fragments. Fascinatingly, the whole structure forms a rough Celtic cross when seen from the air. The stones were placed here approximately 5,000 years ago, so just predate the better-known and larger Stonehenge. They are all of the same rock type, Lewisian gneiss. The central monolith is the tallest at 4.8 metres or 15.5 feet, and shaped like a ship's rudder. The smallest stones are just over a metre tall, or 3.5 feet. Maybe this comment, made by John Morrison in 1680, seems a little fanciful. However, after the Callanish stones were no longer in regular use, peat grew up around them and was not removed until 1857. This exposed staining on the lower parts of the stones, and the different colours apparently reminded the superstitious of false men in contrasting shirts and pants. More practically, in 1695, Martin observed that these stones represented a place appointed for worship in the time of heathenism, though these days we're still not so sure this is so. For hundreds of years, the Druids were thought to have created the site, as some still believe they created Stonehenge, though this monument is very much older than the Druids. Whatever they were for, these lichen-encrusted stones are magical to look at, touch and walk among, and Lady Matterson, whose land they were on in the late 19th century, made a path to bring tourists to them from far and wide. So why do we think this stone structure was created? What was it used for, and for how long? Dating of pottery fragments and the existence of other such monuments in the area suggests that Callanish was an active focus for prehistoric religious activity, or for something else, for at least 1,500 years. It must have been very laborious to erect, involving the cooperation of an integrated and orderly community, and implying they either had slaves or leisure time or both at their disposal. Many theories are still in circulation as to the meaning of the Callanish stones, whether they had astronomical significance, were used in pagan religious ceremonies, possibly for ancestor worship since there was a central tomb, or as some have calculated whether this site represents an 18.6-year cycle of the moon, we will probably never know. But it's all a part of Lewis's intriguing history, and in a short visit you can pass from the Stone Age into the Iron Age of Brochs, or circular dry stone towers built by chieftains over 2,000 years ago. We really aren't sure who the locals were defending themselves against, as the Brochs had largely fallen down by the time the Vikings arrived, first to raid and then to settle. And of course to leave behind the most famous chess pieces of all time in the 12th century, the Lewis chessmen pictured here. All of this excitement long before the advent of the Blackhouses, where we started our tour. But now let's sail on to my favourite destination in the Western Islands, or Hebrides, to St Kilda, or Hirta, as the main island is more correctly called. St Kilda is situated 40 miles, 64 kilometres, west-northwest, even of the remote North Uist, and Hirta's sea cliffs and stacks are the highest in the UK. The red X marks Village Bay, where St Kilda's inhabitants lived until 1930, when their only means of survival became evacuation to mainland Scotland. It's very strange to think that these people who had never seen a tree mainly ended up working in forestry, and rumour has it they had to be shown which end to plant. Here is the view that greets you upon landing and gaining a bit of altitude above the remains of the village. We know there were 180 residents here in 1695. By 1930 that had dwindled to 36. Although there are no permanent residents on St Kilda now, there are always eager volunteers around during the summer, helping to roof some of the old buildings so they will survive for posterity, and generally aiding conservation and maintenance work round the village. You can see their washing hung out to dry here, on one of the few dry days. Even without its romantic history, St Kilda's natural beauty and birdlife have long attracted tourists. Among the village ruins wander primitive Sois sheep. This one has much neater fleece than average. Usually it's matted and tangled and straggly because the sheep remain untended, clumpily molting their umber-coloured wool in summertime. St Kildans made their meagre living for centuries from the wool of the sheep and the feathers and oil of the cliff-nesting fulmars, gannets and puffins. I can't claim to have taken this photo myself. Cottages on the streets such as these were mainly built in 1860, replacing earlier blackhouses. Atmospheric and quaint they may have been, but we can probably agree with Parson Brown's 1799 description of the living accommodation. A more wretched hovel never sheltered beast from the storm than this. He also somewhat high-handedly commented, "The air is infected by a stench almost insupportable, a compound of rotten fish, filth of all sorts, and stinking sea-fowl." The tourist industry began as early as the late 17th century, and such supercilious comments were commonplace. The way of life of these barely human-seeming creatures must have been well-nigh incomprehensible to the wealthy, curious visitor. St Kilda was abandoned in 1930, so grass now covers the street, and most of the cottages, left unrepaired, are crumbling. Yet despite the dilapidation, there is an uncanny atmosphere. One always feels that the inhabitants have just turned a corner, are just out of sight, maybe tending their sheep or gathering birds to pay the rent. The handful of re-roofed cottages, home to volunteers and scientists for a few weeks each summer, shows us that there is still a human connection. And tourists have never stopped coming to St Kilda. As early as 1549, Dean Monroe wrote of "a simple, poor people, scarce learned in any religion." And it was increasing contact with the outside world, finally leading to a dangerous dependence which brought an end to what, for the St Kildans? Was it an idyll of the noble savage spoiled by modern materialism? Or was it a wretched, barely sustainable existence from which they longed to escape? Standing in St Kilda's cemetery, these are questions we may well ponder. For St Kildans, geographical isolation, climate, and the poverty of the soil meant they always lived on the edge. On the right you can see a typical Cleit, a small dry stone structure with a turf or lichened stone roof. Watertight but cross-ventilated, these Cleits were ideal as storerooms for just about everything, but especially for storing the seabirds which provided food and paid the rent. And in the centre is the school bell, which called the children of St Kilda to come and get a limited education. There was no dedicated schoolroom until 1898. Lessons were often interrupted or never even started, whether because of storms, sickness, peat collection, the gathering of birds' eggs, killing and salting of fulmars, etc. Each day, the St Kildan Parliament, consisting of adult men only, would meet, decide what work needed to be done, and allocate it accordingly. These men never paid tax or voted to elect MPs at Westminster. They were too far away from all that. Bare subsistence was their goal. And the church, which was established to bring them comfort, proved a very mixed blessing. Although most Christian ministers who chose to move to St Kilda did so with worthy motives, they were always outsiders imposing their ways on this closed and isolated community. Eager to save the souls of these so-called pagans, they did some good, but much evil. The best remembered is Reverend Mackay, who ministered to the St Kildans from 1865 to 1889. By the time of his departure, the islanders had been browbeaten into so much church attendance every day of the week that they had insufficient time left for the growing and gathering of food. The feather store was one of the few slate-roofed houses. It was very important to keep out the weather, and so it survived better than the average St Kildan home. But even the factor's house, he stayed in it when he came to collect the rent, was only a grander version of the simple family home. In fact, the whole of Village Bay provides an impressive example of a Stone Age culture. But note the intrusion into this rural idyll, the gun, though it has never been fired. In 1912, a wireless had been introduced into St Kilda so that its inhabitants could contact the outside world if on the point of starvation. This led to German shelling of the island and the war. No one was hurt, but a small naval detachment arrived to defend the island. Thus the villagers learned how other British citizens lived, and this, together with increasing tourism, doomed them. But in their heyday, how did the St Kildans live? Certainly no attempt at growing vegetables in significant quantities met with any success. They rented their island from the MacLeods of Harris and Dunvegan in Skye. They paid in produce, namely tweed and wool, feathers and bird oil. By 1900, tweed, made from the wool they plucked from their sheep, was the only product valued by the outside world, from which they bought tea, sugar, salt, paraffin, corn, seed, tools and furniture. Also, understandably, whisky and tobacco. But the St Kildan economy stood or fell by its seabirds. For most of the 19th century, gannet and fulmar oil was exported and sold to provide heating, lighting and even medicine on the mainland. Fulmar and puffin feathers were used to stuff mattresses. And of course puffins, fulmars and gannets provided the St Kildans' main nutrition. Seabirds lived on the cliffs and on the stacks of the islands in their tens of thousands, and the men were agile climbers, scaling awesome heights, using homemade ropes to collect both birds and eggs. Every part of the bird was used, even the entrails, as manure. It's hardly surprising that visitors complained. The smell of their houses, clothes and breaths is very offensive to a stranger. When Lady Grange was exiled to St Kilda from 1734 to 1742 for revealing her husband's Jacobite sympathies, she must have suffered horribly as an outsider, though by all accounts she didn't make much effort to be absorbed into the community. Finally, with other sources of revenue failing, tourism became all important. This was not a happy situation. From the early 18th century, there had been outbreaks of cholera and smallpox introduced from visiting ships. After 1750, the local population never exceeded 70 individuals. Wealthy tourists behaved as if they were visiting a zoo, which was not appreciated. But when the profits from tourism came to dominate the economy, it was the beginning of the end. After all, the villagers were not actually prisoners. After World War I, many of the young and active men emigrated, leaving the aged and the very young. A series of hard winters reduced the population to 36 people, and in 1930 the St Kildans themselves decided that they could not continue and asked to be evacuated to the mainland. The idyll was over. The myth, of course, remains. Well, that brings us to the end of our tour of Lewis and St Kilda. Of course, there are many more islands worth exploring in both Inner and Outer Hebrides. Hope to see you there one day, not too far in the future.